This is a mystery that's as old as the world itself. It's a journey that seems to be unending. It's a question that every human holds in his heart. What does the God who created all of the universe look like? In this special episode, we're in search of the face of God. The face of Jesus Christ is one of the most recognized in the world. We become familiar with it from childhood, and without any doubt, we know that this person with his intense eyes, straight nose, long hair and beard is Jesus. But how is it that we know these features truly belong to Jesus? Interestingly, the written sources, such as the Gospels, don't specifically describe the appearance of Christ. Let's start our journey of discovery in Rome exploring ancient depictions of Jesus. Father Sergio Mercancin, an expert in the study of icons, points us in the right direction.
We find the first images in the catacombs of Rome. The interesting thing is that Rome, and on this theme we have done conferences with scholars, that Rome has this privilege to have the oldest icons in the world, both Marian and Christological.
Below street level, in the catacombs, we see Jesus Christ represented as the Good Shepherd, young and without a beard. Early Christian artists in Rome represented Jesus according to their imaginations and pagan background. Scholars say that Jesus in these images looks similar to the Roman gods Jupiter, Neptune, or Serapis. These depictions, though, do not look like what has become the standard image of Jesus that we now know. A few centuries later, representations of Christ would dramatically change. Starting in the 4th century in Rome, Jesus began to be shown in the way we know him today.
There is an icon of Christ that was found in Ostia a few decades ago that dates back to the 4th or 5th century. Then there is the so-called Acropita icon that is not painted by the human hand at the Lateran. That could be from the 6th or 7th century.
To explain this evolution, we turn to Rome resident and art historian Elizabeth Lev.
In the period post the legalization of Christianity, we start to think, with a little help on the part of the emperor, in terms of Jesus as teacher, the authority of Jesus, Jesus as lawgiver. And that is when Jesus begins to mature a little bit more into the expression of the bearded figure, the image of the rabbi, the image of the teacher. And more or less regally, sometimes it'll be more regal, sometimes it'll be more teacher, the image of Jesus proceeds in this direction with variations. The infant Christ, of course, is represented in early Christian art, but it's very stylized. It's not really a question of looking in the face of Christ. And obviously, the greatest moment when the Christians really concentrate on Jesus' face is when we start to create icons, objects that are made not only for prayer but also for theological understanding. And so we begin to develop a very sort of the image based on the image of the teacher, but with a great many symbolic aspects to a wide throat filled with the Holy Spirit. These symbolic aspects that are meant to teach even as you are communicating via the image.
The Redemptoris Mater Chapel of the Apostolic Palace in the Vatican, where popes go to pray. Every mosaic is steeped in meaning. The works of art in the chapel were largely designed by Ivan Rupnik, who managed to reconcile the Eastern and Western church traditions in his art.
All'inizio era una unica fonte e anche I cristiani.
In the beginning, it was the one and only source. The Christians created a kind of koine, a language that could be understood among Christians. For example, I take a Romanesque church in Asturias in Spain, and I take the Russian Byzantine church. I understand the images, because language is still truly theological and dogmatic of the church and the liturgy.
Teologico, dogmatico, della Chiesa, della liturgia.
Rupnik says that ancient art of Christian West and East had one single source. The question then becomes, what was that first source, that first representation of Christ that inspired and brought uniformity to all depictions thereafter? In a few moments, we'll be back with more on Vaticano. It's thought that the first representation of Jesus' face as we know it was inspired by a first source, a first icon. Ito Etienne Rome senior contributor Paul Bade has dedicated much of his life to tracking it down. He's a sort of Catholic equivalent to Indiana Jones. He says that to find the true face of God, we should not only look for it in the Bible, but also in the Mass, specifically in the liturgy of the Eucharist, when Jesus himself is made present.
It formed part of the liturgy, inasmuch as when it came to the old altars in the old rite, the ritus latinus, Latin rite, the altar was not a table, it was a funeral bench, like there is at the tomb of Christ, as there is in the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. It was a bench on which Christ lay, and the altars were graves. They were not tables. And then there was the great tablecloth. That was the burial shroud. That was the sindone. And the small corporal that touched the host, that touched the face of Christ, was the volto santo, il sudario.
Volto santo, il sudario.
That sindone, or shroud, that covered Jesus' body in the tomb is kept in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in the northern Italian city of Turin. And the sudario, or sudarium, that covered his face, also known as Veronica's veil, is also in Italy. There are several veils in existence that could be the sudarium. Two in particular draw the most attention. One is the veil kept under lock and key in St. Peter's Basilica. It's shown from the balcony above the statue of St. Veronica once a year on the 5th Sunday of Lent, but is otherwise kept in a chapel within the pillar. However, Bade believes that a second veil hidden away in Italy's central Abruzzi region is the original. It's kept continuously on display behind the altar of the Basilica Shrine of the Holy Face in the little town of Manopello.
Just as we see today in the Holy Sudario in Manopello, it has been folded 4 times. The very old name of this veil is the four-folded. We see today clearly 4 folds, 1 fold like this, then 3 like this. In the same way, the shrouds were folded over the corporal. The corporal is the veil that had always been in contact with a transformed Christ. As it says in the Gospel, that there was the veil, the sudarium, the veil that was on Christ's face had touched it.
Das wurde in Entsprechung gesetzt.
Bade believes the holy veil of Manopello was once kept in St. Peter's, but was smuggled away for safekeeping in the 1500s, around the time of the sack of Rome. While just as with the Shroud of Turin, there are endless questions about its authenticity, there's no question that it's unique. The fine cloth of the veil has no equal. It's made of byssus, also known as sea silk, filaments produced by a certain type of Mediterranean mollusk. The material, just as the image imposed upon it, surprisingly changes before your eyes, depending on the light. Scientists have found no trace of pigment, ink, or paint on the cloth. Christ's face is simply there. Though the veil is largely unknown today, it wasn't always so. Comparing the face of Manopello with Michelangelo's Christ from the Pietà, and with the most valuable work of art in the world, Leonardo da Vinci's Salvator Mundi, one can see the resemblance, suggesting that medieval and Renaissance artists looked to the veil as their source, the true icon, that first image.
The face of Christ and devotion to the face of Christ, which comes from the arrival of the Veronica's veil, which leaves the Veronica, the woman who wiped Christ's face on the road to Calvary, and the cloth that has Jesus' face imprinted on it, really begins to circulate in the 1100s. We begin to hear about it, we hear about it, and it's exhibited in St. Peter's as of basically the Middle Ages, so 1100s, 1200s. You begin to see it, this idea of an actual image of Jesus's face. So we do have this idea. Jesus's face, as it is in the Veronica, is very similar to the face that has been created by artists over the years. And then to confirm or to assist the image of the face of the Veronica, then we have the face of the Shroud of Turin, which is this negative image in the shroud that contains Jesus's body. And that really goes on a pretty regular display in the 1400s. So we have an image that it turns out that the image that the Christians worked their way towards in the bulk of Christian art is very similar to the image of the man of the shroud and the image of the man of the veil.
The similarity between the image from the Shroud of Turin and the face of Manopello is uncanny. If one were placed on top of the other, they would perfectly coincide. Still, there are so many questions. The veil of Manopello has yet to be fully tested for its chemical properties and age, but taking into account its influence on medieval sacred art, the image is indubitably a top candidate to be the so-called Vera Nica. Vera, Latin for true, and icone, Greek for image. The true image, the Veronica, together with the Shroud of Turin, which we're going to discover next. The Shroud of Turin is a large linen cloth that bears traces of blood and water and the image of a man with wounds on his wrists, feet, head, back, legs, and chest. The shroud is highly protected and conserved in a temperature and air-controlled case in Turin's cathedral. Because of its uniqueness and importance, the shroud is only displayed on rare occasion. But it can always be observed in high-resolution copies. Rome's Pontifical Regina Apostolorum University has one on permanent display. Father Andrew Dalton oversees the exhibition and the university's Syndonology department, which is dedicated to the study of the shroud. He shared with us what he sees when he looks at it.
I think that the deepest longing in the heart of man is to see the face of God. And so if the shroud gives us even a pale image of the semblance of the Savior, then I say, blessed are we. There's something that tugs on our heartstrings, isn't it, when we look to this face and we contemplate the sufferings of this man and remember that he paid a debt that he didn't owe because I owed a debt that I can't pay. I think we need to spend more time looking at that, contemplating that, and the shroud exhibit helps us do that. The shroud acts as a photo document where the grayscale is inverted so that the photo negative is the positive image. Secondly, the shroud contains three-dimensional information, and so we were able to reproduce a statue of this man, the cadaver as it laid in the tomb, based on information in a two-dimensional cloth. That is unlike any other document in the history of the world. But then there's more than that. Look at all the sufferings of this man. He is shown to be crucified. There are nail wounds in the hands, in the feet. He's wearing a crown of thorns. He's also been scourged and pierced in the side. That's at least 4 different types of very specific pathologies that converge on the person of Jesus, who we read about in the historical documents of the Gospels. So that's important information. Especially important is the crown of thorns, right? Because we don't know of any other crucified man who was crowned, and yet the man of the shroud was. There is no paint anywhere on the shroud. We were looking for that. In 1978, an elite team of scientists came to Italy to study the shroud to answer just this question. What formed the image on the shroud? Is it a painting, a scourging? Is it a medieval photograph, or perhaps a rubbing? These were 4 major theories. But you know, when they came here to study it, they found out that there is no paint, no pigment, inorganic or organic, no varnish, no dye, and get this, no directionality, no brush strokes whatsoever. Whatever this is not human artwork. That was the conclusion of this team of scientists, the STURP, Shroud of Turin Research Project of 1978.
If science were to prove the Shroud of Turin was not made by human hands, and that the man depicted died in the 1st century in the Holy Land, the question of the proto-images, or first images, would be resolved.
The Sudarium
and the Sindone are the 2 first pages of the Gospel. You know, there are big debates among theologians about when the Gospel came into being. When did the Gospel of Mark come into being? When did the Gospel of Matthew, Luke, and John come into being? 30 years later, 60 years later, and so on. But these 2 cloths, these are the 2 pictorial documents. They are documents, but pictorial documents, and they come from the very first second of Christ's resurrection in Jerusalem. It is the very first, on Easter morning, when John the Apostle and Peter entered the tomb. These 2 lay there like scrolls, recounting the passion and the resurrection of Christ.
Looking at these 2 artifacts, the Shroud of Turin and the Veil of Manopello, with the eyes of faith, they both communicate God's desire to show His face to humanity. But in that case, why not leave behind something more complete, like a color picture? Let's go now to Vilnius, Lithuania, where a 20th century Polish nun, a real saint, dictated to an artist how to paint Christ's full-body portrait, after receiving instructions from Jesus himself. We'll be back after a short break with more on Vaticano. Here in Vilnius, Lithuania, Polish-born Saint Faustina Kowalska received repeated mystical visions of Jesus. To discover the incredible story of Sister Kowalska in the visions, during which Jesus presented himself as the King of Divine Mercy, we joined a pilgrim group to walk the way of mercy at her former home.
We are in St. Faustina's house, and in most important place in the house, in place where lived St. Faustina. And in this place, Sister Faustina had many meetings with Jesus, many visions of Jesus. In this place, she began write her diary. In this place, Jesus dictated for St. Faustina Chaplet of Divine Mercy. Here in Vilnius, Sister Faustina met Father Sopochka.
Father Sopochko was the spiritual director of St. Faustina. He carefully examined her visions and after initial skepticism, believed that they were truly coming from Jesus. It was Father Sopochko who commissioned the Lithuanian painter Eugeneusz Kazimierowski to paint an image that Jesus himself had requested from St. Faustina. This chapel used to be the painter's studio, right here in absolute secrecy under strict supervision of St. Faustina. The image was completed in 1934. And this is what they came up with, the image of merciful Jesus, known globally today as the Divine Mercy image. At first, church authorities didn't believe Faustina and prohibited the display of the image, but after a year, it was temporarily put on display for veneration from April the 26th to 28th, 1935. The image was displayed side by side with the miraculous icon of Our Lady of the Gate of Dawn. When the communist regime came to power, the original image was hidden away for a long period of time. It was only rediscovered in the early 2000s. It's now on display in the Church of the Holy Trinity, known as the Shrine of Divine Mercy, in the Lithuanian capital of Vilnius. Here, people come to contemplate God face to face, something no one on earth ever did until Jesus took on human flesh. In Old Testament times, the first commandment given to Moses and other passages from Scripture were interpreted to mean that God had forbidden representations of himself on earth.
In the Old Testament we have this history that God said, you cannot see my face, you can see only behind me. That is also a beautiful message, because we must follow God, and when we follow God, we cannot see the face, but we see the behind. But in the New Testament, God has revealed his face in Jesus Christ, and Jesus lives in a very close relation with God the Father, face to face, and have shown and revealed God's face in the world.
Even then, the veracity of the image of Christ and whether or not God should be represented artistically continued to be a point of discussion among the first followers of Christ.
Let's start with the very beginning of the Christians who have just surmounted the enormous problem of how and should we show an image of Jesus in art. I mean, we have the whole problem of the first commandment, thou shalt not make images, and now the Christians are thinking about making an image of Christ. Why can we make an image of Jesus? Because he is God made man, because he is the Word made flesh. So it's always important that we start with any discussion of the visible God with the idea that the reason why we can have an image of God is because of the second person and the incarnation.
But it wasn't until the Second Ecumenical Council of Nicaea that the issue was more officially put to rest. The incarnation was the triumphal argument that ended the dispute over sacred images and resolved the Byzantine heresy of the 8th century known as iconoclasm.
8
depicting God in sacred art in the universal church was proclaimed once and for all licit. Considering all arguments that the classical representation of Jesus is truly his image, to believe it or not is up to every person. What's undoubtedly true is that through his incarnation, God showed his human face. Perhaps, though, to know Christ's face, it's enough to simply look at the people around us.